What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? When one of the most outspoken figures in modern politics sits across from one of Britain's most provocative talk show hosts? It sounds like the beginning of a riddle, or maybe a boxing match. But on this night, it was neither. It was television. Live, unscripted, and unpredictable. The stage was set for one of the most unforgettable confrontations in talk show history. It was a Friday night in London, and the BBC studios hummed with anticipation. Staff bustled through the narrow hallways, clipboards in hand, walkie-talkies buzzing with final instructions. The Jonathan Ross Show was always a lively affair. Guests from the world of film, comedy, politics, and business made their way onto his iconic curved sofa, where conversations slipped easily from humor into controversy. But tonight felt different. Jonathan Ross himself was in his dressing room, flipping through his notes with that trademark smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. He knew his guest well enough by reputation. Brash, boastful, larger than life. Donald Trump was the very embodiment of excess. Gold-plated skyscrapers, best-selling books with his name in bold, and a television persona honed through The Apprentice. In 2009, he wasn't yet a politician. He was a brand, a businessman, a symbol of American capitalism in its most unapologetic form. For Ross, this was gold. He thrived on tension, on walking that thin line between playful banter and pointed jabs. If anyone could puncture Trump's self-importance with a well-placed quip, it was Jonathan Ross. Backstage, Trump's arrival was nothing short of theatrical. Fashionably late, as always, he swept into the green room with his usual air of command. His entourage flanked him like loyal soldiers, but it was clear who held the spotlight. Trump moved with the assurance of a man who expected the world to bend around him. "Great setup you've got here," he said, gesturing broadly to the studio's sleek design. He shook hands with producers, complimented the lighting, and even found a moment to grumble about London's famously dreary weather. Everyone laughed, though whether out of genuine amusement or nervous politeness, no one could say for sure. To the production team, it seemed like business as usual. Trump was charming, affable, and clearly ready to deliver the kind of television moment that would keep viewers glued to their screens. When the time came, the floor manager gave the signal, and Jonathan Ross stepped onto the set to thunderous applause. He worked the crowd with ease, his wit sharp but warm, his energy infectious. Then, with a flourish, he introduced his guest. "Ladies and gentlemen, the man who literally wrote the book on making deals, Donald Trump." The crowd erupted. Applause echoed through the studio as Trump emerged, waving confidently, his grin wide and his stride deliberate. He soaked it in, every clap and cheer feeding his ego. He sat down on the iconic curved sofa like a king settling onto his throne, his body language exuding complete self-assurance. The interview began innocently enough. Ross lobbed easy questions about Trump's London property ambitions, his thoughts on the booming real estate market, his latest book, and of course, the behind-the-scenes drama of The Apprentice. Trump was in his element. He told anecdotes about celebrity encounters, boasted about skyscrapers and casinos, and dropped names like confetti. The audience responded exactly as expected, laughing, clapping, leaning forward in fascination. For the first 15 minutes, the interview was smooth, polished entertainment. Trump dominated the stage, his confidence filling the room like oxygen. But Jonathan Ross was not known for keeping things polite for long. He had built his career on asking the questions others were too cautious to voice, always with that sly grin and a twinkle in his eye. And as he leaned forward in his chair, the shift was almost imperceptible. The energy in the room changed. Those who had seen Ross at work before knew what was coming. "Donald," Ross began, his voice light but deliberate, "some people say your business practices are ruthless. Do you ever feel that way yourself?" The effect was immediate. Trump's smile didn't vanish completely, but it froze just enough to betray his irritation. The practiced warmth in his voice gave way to something harder. "Ruthless? Jonathan, I think that's a very unfair characterization. I'm a businessman. I make deals.
Sometimes people don't like the deals I make because they're not as good at making deals as I am." A ripple of laughter moved through the audience, but it was thinner now, less certain. Ross leaned back slightly, but his eyes sparkled with mischief. He wasn't finished. "But surely," he pressed, "you can understand why some people might feel that way when they read about tenants being displaced or small contractors not being paid what they're owed. I mean, these are real people's lives we're talking about." The studio grew noticeably quieter. The playful energy that had filled the air earlier was gone, replaced with a sense of unease. Viewers at home might not have seen it, but those in the studio could feel the tension tightening like a rope. Trump straightened in his seat, his voice firm now, edged with defensiveness. "Look, Jonathan, I think you've been reading too much fake news. The stories you're referring to are completely blown out of proportion by people who have an agenda against successful businessmen like myself." Ross raised an eyebrow, his smile fading just a fraction. "Fake news. These are court filings, Donald. Legal proceedings. Are you saying the courts are fake news?" Trump's face flushed, his jaw tightening. "The courts can be wrong, Jonathan. They can be influenced by politics, by people who don't want to see success. I've won far more cases than I've lost, and the ones I've lost were based on technicalities, not the truth." The audience was transfixed. They had come expecting lighthearted celebrity chatter, but now they were watching a clash of egos unfold before their very eyes. This was no longer a routine interview. It was a duel. Ross, sensing the vulnerability, pressed further. "But what about the contractors, the small business owners who say they did work for you and didn't get paid? Are they all lying? Are they all part of some grand conspiracy against Donald Trump?" The voice rose slightly, his irritation spilling over. "You know what, Jonathan? I don't like where this is going. I came here to talk about my book, to have a pleasant conversation, not to be ambushed by someone who clearly has an agenda." "I don't have an agenda, Donald. I'm just asking questions that I think the audience deserves answers to. Isn't that what journalism is about?" "This isn't journalism. This is a hit job. This is exactly the kind of biased, unfair treatment that successful people like me have to deal with from the media establishment." The room went silent. The audience, once so lively, was now holding its collective breath. The producers in the control booth exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to intervene or let the fireworks play out. And there it was. The moment when the interview shifted from late-night entertainment to something entirely different. Two men with oversized egos had just collided. Jonathan Ross, the provocateur with a flair for exposing arrogance, and Donald Trump, the self-styled king of deals who refused to be questioned. The polite banter was over. The stage had become an interrogation chamber. And for the first time that evening, it wasn't clear who would walk away victorious. As Jonathan Ross pressed harder, Donald Trump's carefully constructed composure began to fracture. The warm smile he had entered with was gone, replaced by a scowl that only deepened with each pointed question. His voice rose above the murmurs of the audience, sharper now, accusatory. He accused Ross of bias, of setting him up, of turning what should have been a light-hearted interview into what he called a hit job. For a man who prided himself on his ability to dominate any stage, Trump suddenly looked cornered. The businessman who built his persona on never backing down, who often boasted that he was the toughest negotiator in any room, was finding himself on unfamiliar ground. And for those watching, the mask of charm was slipping. But Ross, however, wasn't fazed. This was his element, the moment when laughter turned into tension, when light entertainment teetered on the edge of something raw and real. With cold precision, he leaned forward, refusing to give Trump the space to wriggle free. "What about the workers, Donald? The electricians, the painters, the plumbers, real people who went to court just to collect what you owed them. Do you deny that?" The studio fell silent. Every eye was fixed on the two men. Even the laughter that usually bubbled beneath Ross's sharp jabs had evaporated. Viewers at home could feel the weight of the moment through their screens. Trump fired back quickly, his voice rising, his hand cutting through the air with sharp gestures. That's called strategic business. You settle where it makes sense. You negotiate. That's how winners play the game. But Ross didn't let him off the hook. His retort came swift, cutting through the explanation like a blade. Strategic business? No, Donald, that's cheating. That's not strategy. That's breaking promises to honest people who trusted you. The audience gasped. Phones, which until then had stayed mostly pocketed, began to appear like fireflies in the crowd. People instinctively knew they were witnessing history in the making. A talk show had transformed into a high-stakes confrontation. And then Ross, with perfect timing, delivered his trump card.